there. Okay, I've unmuted now. Can everybody see my screen?
Oh, yes.
Okay,
yes,
excellent. Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. So as we move on here, this is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to move away from sensors and gait and smart devices and start talking about a human-centered approach to thinking about older adults and how they use technology in combination with the people who are around them. So that's what we're going to be doing today here. So I'm going to do some introduction and definitions, and then I'm going to talk about some studies that I was involved with when I was at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte about patient portals and how people use those in combination with the people around them. And then since I've come back to Canada in 2019, when I joined the University of Manitoba, I've been looking at banking and how older adults and the people around them are dealing with the banking system. And we're going to end by thinking through and talking about some possible design considerations relating to how you might set up accounts, knowing that it's not necessarily always the older adult who's using these systems. And I'll end with some takeaways that are relevant to older adults and mobility, hopefully. So, e-services is sort of the general class of systems that I'm going to talk about today. And this is any kind of system that is hosted on the internet where you log in with credentials and then get access to your data and can run functions with your data. So these are everywhere. You use them all the time: online banking, tracking your online cell phone usage. There's lots of e-government services, etc. And these are really great. They have a lot of benefits. If you live in a rural area, they're more accessible. If you have mobility restrictions, this may allow you to do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. In bad weather, they allow you to avoid the bad weather. That's a big thing here sometimes in Winnipeg. And there's also the ability to avoid the COVID virus, which we've seen has been pretty important in this most recent pandemic. So there's lots of reasons that it's important to really support these e-services, and they're becoming more common as lots of stores and services move away from brick and mortar locations and move online. But there are some problems. E-services require people to have internet access and devices and an email account to register with, and in general, a level of tech savviness. And so not everybody will have all of these things. And we know that in the particular case of older adults, it can be the case that they actually end up relying on other people to help them use things like e-services because they don't have the tech savviness or they don't have the technology or access. And that's not to say that all older adults are like that. There are obviously many older adults who are doing these things quite well. But even the older adults who are able to use these e-services will still occasionally need help for some reason. So what I want to focus on today really is the close other ecosystem. So older adults often have a variety of different people helping them. And it's not just one person for everything. It's often a couple of different people who help with different types of tasks. So it's not a single person, it really is an ecosystem. And while it's quite often a spouse or an adult child, we also know that in some cases it's a friend or a neighbor. So it's not necessarily somebody who's in that really close, very, very trusted circle. So what I'd love to do is to hear from you for a moment. Have you ever helped an older adult, somebody who's 65 or older, with some kind of e-service? If so, please go ahead and type the type of service you helped an older adult with in the chat window, and let's see how people have been using this. So maybe banking, maybe shopping. Anybody? Banking. Okay, so banking seems to be a common one. Anybody else helping? Email and shopping. Okay, seeing a lot of shopping. Email. All right. Okay. So vaccine booking, right? Yeah, that's become an important one recently. So healthcare, right, in general. Okay, so there are a lot of these types of things. Oh, even entertainment and streaming movies. So you can see that this really is quite broad. There are lots of ways that people around older adults are helping them with e-services. So there is something that's called a proxy account. This is an official way that an e-service can support the close other. And so the definition of a proxy account is an account provided by an e-service to a second person so they can act on behalf of the account holder, right? And there are a couple of important points about proxy accounts. Typically, a proxy account means that the proxy has separate login credentials. So they have their own username and password. And the second thing is proxy accounts may have limited functionality. So if I had a proxy bank account for my father, for example, maybe I could only go in and check the balance, monitor things, and pay bills, but I maybe wouldn't be allowed to transfer money out. So that would be an example of a proxy account with limited access. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about the patient portal studies that I did while I was down in the US. And so first I have to tell you what a patient portal is. These are not as common in Canada as they are in the US, where they become very ubiquitous due to Obama's Healthcare Act. So this is a healthy service where you can log in through your hospital or healthcare clinic. You can get access to a lot of data and a lot of functionality. So you can see your lab results, you can ask your doctor questions, schedule appointments, refill meds, all that type of stuff. These are really wonderful. Having lived in the US for 14 years, I use these extensively and they're fantastic. They really empower people to manage their healthcare. And some portals at various hospitals and clinics and so on offer official proxy accounts where a close other can get a separate login and help with the health management. This is obviously ubiquitous for parents of small children because the small children don't log in themselves, but it's also possible for people who are helping older adults with their health care. So we did a series of patient portal studies to understand sort of adoption barriers, and we were focusing on low-income older adults in the United States, in North Carolina in particular. The first study was a longitudinal study with 200 users. We interviewed them every 6 months over a period of 2 years to understand whether they were using the patient portal, what barriers to access they might be experiencing. And then we did a small follow-up interview study with 10 of those users to understand their attitudes about having their proxies or their close others, the people around them, access the patient portal on their behalf. And finally, we did a third study, which was what I call a secret shopper study, where we surveyed US hospitals to understand whether they had proxy accounts and how they recommended people get access to help others with their healthcare. So the first study, this is the longitudinal study with 200 users. What we really found from the study was that almost all of those patients who were older adults had at least one caregiver, somebody who was a close other, who helped them with their healthcare management. And a number of these helped by using the patient's portal. So we saw this as an opportunity. It seems that if we really want people to adopt these patient portals and feel more empowered in managing their healthcare, older adults can really particularly benefit from this, and they might benefit most if we can promote and support the proxy usage of those portals. The study 2, where we actually interviewed the 10 people, what we found was that those patients definitely see benefits to using the patient portal, and they definitely saw benefits in having their close others be able to access the portal on their behalf to do things like interpret test results and schedule appointments and things like that. And what we found was that some of the patients had given their close others their own login credentials. So a patient is sharing their personal password and username with their adult child or their niece or their neighbor, so that person could go in and help them to do whatever needed to be done. And none of those people, none of the 10 people that we interviewed had bothered setting up the official proxy accounts, even though in this particular healthcare system, hospital system, proxy accounts were available. So one of the other things we found out was that patients had no idea how much information was on these patient portals, because it really can contain full medical histories, past diagnoses, etc., that the patient may not want to share all of that information with that close other proxy. So they definitely had concerns about sharing stigmatized illnesses, if there was a mental health diagnosis or a substance abuse diagnosis or reproductive health decisions. Those types of things are sensitive and may not be shared. If the close other is a spouse, probably that person knows all of this. But if it's anything beyond a spouse, there are definitely some things that the close others, even if they're an adult child, may not know, and the older adult may not want them to know. However, in almost all cases, the patient said that If it was an absolute emergency and the person helping needed to know, they would be okay with that information being shared. So you can see that there's different levels of sharing that's desired and different temporal aspects of that sharing that come into play as well. So I want to talk for a second about issues around password sharing. So if an older adult shares their credentials to a patient portal or to some other e-service with their close others so that that close other can help them, there are some problems. So from a privacy perspective, there is the close other getting access to more information than the older adult might want. So in the patient portal example, it could be stigmatized diagnoses. It could be, in the US, a huge raft of medical bills that are past due, and the patient might not want the close other to know about this. So we see a lot of different aspects of these privacy issues coming into play, especially in the healthcare setting. And then there are security issues. We know in computer science, in IT, that people often tend to reuse passwords across different systems. So even though people are not supposed to do this and people are constantly told not to do this, it's a really, really common practice. People do it anyways because setting up a bazillion different passwords and remembering them all is hard. And that's why people reuse their passwords across different systems. So if an older adult shares their password to their patient portal with a niece, for example, because the niece is a nurse and she can help interpret test results, they may have suddenly just also shared their banking password with that niece, or the password to their email, or to their government retirement benefits, or any of those types of things. So that close other could then get access to those other systems. There's also logging issues. So from a security perspective, we often log what users do so that if some issue comes up, we can go back and look and examine and see what happened. But for e-services, if people are sharing passwords, then from the perspective of the e-service, it looks like it's only the account holder who's taking all those actions, even though it may in fact be a close other in a support role. And then, of course, there are problems with potential insurance fraud and impersonation once people have the passwords of the older adults that they are helping. So the third study in this patient portal series was this secret shopper study. So we realized that there were definite issues with security around proxy access to patient portals. And so we really wanted to see what's happening with patient portals in the US. And so we did the secret shopper study. We called 102 different hospitals, 2 per state, and including DC. And basically, this was secret shopper because we were pretending, there was deception involved. We were pretending to be a person whose elderly mother was moving into the area where the hospital was located and was looking to get set up with a new health system. And so the person calling the interviewing was saying, basically, I don't live there and I want to be able to log in and help my mother with her healthcare management. So the first question was, do you offer proxy accounts? And we were only calling hospitals that we knew had patient portals. So do you offer proxy accounts? And a few details about that. And then what's the easiest way for me to access my mother's portal if I need to help her with some kind of healthcare management? And then for the ones who said that they do offer proxy accounts, we asked, can my mother limit sort of what I'm able to see and do if I have a proxy account on this portal? So those were the types of questions that we were asking. And what we found was that 68% of the hospitals that we called did offer proxy accounts. There were 27 who didn't, and the remainder were, when we talked to the IT staff, and that's who we were calling, they had no idea if there were proxy accounts or not. So of these 68% of the hospitals that offered proxy accounts, only 19% of them allowed any kind of access control. So allowed people to say, well, I only want my close other proxy to be able to schedule appointments and renew my prescriptions. I don't want them to be able to message the doctor, right? So you can imagine lots of different scenarios where different types of functionality and information is desired as visible and accessible and others not. But most hospitals are not offering any kind of control. If a proxy is given access, they see and can do everything. So that's quite problematic. But the most problematic part of this study, the most troubling result, was that when we asked the hospital IT staff, what's the easiest way for me to access my mother's portal, 45% of the people that we talked to recommended having my elderly mother share her password with me. So, and this is IT staff, so they should know better. And so in some cases, this was because the hospital didn't offer proxy accounts, but this happened obviously in cases where the hospital did have proxy accounts too. And the IT staff person still suggested that it's just easier if the mother shares her password. So this is really highly problematic. So what all of this suggests is that, you know, these systems need to actually provide proxy accounts. They need to make them easy to set up. They need to make sure that there's granular access control, because if I'm going to give somebody a proxy account, I may not want them to see everything. And they also need to make sure that staff are appropriately trained with respect to issues around password sharing. So now I want to move on to a different domain. So I haven't really done much with the patient portal research since I moved to Canada, because there just aren't very many of them here yet, and there are almost none in Manitoba. So I've really been focusing on other e-services, and there's lots of domains where e-services are important. And so I've been focusing on banking more recently, because it's a pretty critical function for, you know, facilitating everyday life. And lots of people are banking. And we know from Bank of Canada reports that lots of older adults are in fact using online banking. So we need to understand what this means. So again, I'd like to turn it back to you for a second. And I want you to imagine this horrible thing, sorry. Just for a moment, imagine that you were in a terrible car crash and you ended up in a full body cast for a few months. So thinking about that situation, you can't get online and do your own banking because you don't have access to your arms. So how many people would you trust with your online banking password so that they could help you pay bills? And so what I'd like you to do is just type the number in the chat. Is there one person you trust? 2, 0, 3? Okay, so I'm seeing some 1s, some 3s, some 2s. Okay, somebody said 5. That's a lot of people. Okay, so you know, you have to think carefully about giving people access, and people tend to be really, they keep their finances pretty close to their hearts, right? They don't like to share financial information. They don't like people to know how much money they have in their bank account. So often there's, you know, a parent or a sibling or an adult child that you might trust. Hopefully, for some people, there might not be. And if there isn't somebody like that that you could trust, that's a close family member, you may need to end up trusting somebody who's a neighbor or a friend. Okay. So we did a survey of close others. So again, these are the people surrounding older adults who help them with various tasks. So we're surveying close others who help older adults with banking, and we got responses from 44 people. And so they helped older adults with like a wide variety of banking tasks. So transferring money, paying bills, all these types of things. What we found was that if they're helping an older adult with banking tasks, they were much more likely to do that on behalf. So they're actually going in and doing it completely on behalf of the older adult, rather than sort of sitting with the older adult and assisting them to complete the task. There was a little bit of that, but it was much more just, I'm doing it for them. And predominantly the modality for providing that support was online banking. So what we found was that many of the people who responded to the survey knew the online banking credentials of the older adult they helped. So they knew the older adult's banking password and username. And a number of them were designated as financial power of attorney. So that's probably fine in that case for them to have that level. But this wasn't a perfect overlap. There were, I think, 4 to 5 people in the sample who were not designated power of attorney, and they knew the banking passwords of the older adults that they helped. And this isn't really particularly surprising, right? If you need help, this is the easiest way to get that kind of help, is to share those credentials. So I'd like to share this quote from one of our survey respondents who said, I have power of attorney for my mother. I live in one city. She lives in another city far away. She still has the ability to do her own banking, but needs occasional assistance. The bank will not give me my own ATM card or online banking credentials. I'm only allowed to do that when she's declared incompetent, and then I take over and she gets no access at all. I can only assist her by going into my local branch and have them do all the things I would do with online banking. It's been very inconvenient and very frustrating. When she's declared incompetent, I'm not sure how I will get her cash when she needs it. So this is sort of a typical issue that we see with older adults and the close others who are helping them. And I really want to highlight here the occasional assistance part of this. So there's a sort of a view from the bank's point where we have fully capable older adults, and then we have older adults who are completely incapable, and there's a power of attorney and somebody else is banking on behalf of them. It's a black and white binary type view, and it's really not accurate. There's a big spectrum between not needing any help at all ever and being completely incompetent and not being able to do anything and having somebody else act completely on your behalf. There's a lot of gray area in between, and that is not viewed or recognized by banks or generally by e-services at all. And so, I also want to note here that, this person knows how to use online banking and would prefer to be able to do online banking on behalf of their mother, but the bank didn't allow them, not in any official capacity. And so if that person really wanted to help their mother with online banking, that person probably would get the password from their mother. So now that I've sort of set up these issues, what I'd like to do is take a human-centered approach to think about how could we design e-services knowing that close others are playing this really important role in assisting older adults with technology and e-service use. So this is, again, within the context of, let's remember that the close others are a wide variety of people. It's often not just one person. So, you might have a spouse who helps you with your online healthcare, and an adult child who helps you with online banking, and, a neighbor who's an accountant who helps you with your government tax filing online, things like that, right? It could be a wide variety. And this ecology, this ecosystem of close others also changes, right? People's relationships are not static. They change over time. So we need to think about these proxy accounts, keeping in mind that all of this is a fluid, dynamic, changing ecosystem with a number of different people, not just one permanent, static close other playing the role of a helper, right? And, anything that we design in this sense may help not just older adults, because there may be lots of others who also need proxy help. Somebody who's got a disability, somebody who suddenly gets a serious illness. This could happen to anybody and need this kind of proxy help. So the first thing that I think is really critical, thinking through the temporality and the fact that relationships change, is this idea of the of expiry dates, right? If we're going to set up a proxy account for somebody, we probably want to put in checks so that every 6 months or every year, we are checking to see, do you still want that person to have proxy access, and requiring the older adult to renew that. And that could be done by the phone, they could be called to check up on it or what have you. It doesn't necessarily require the older adult to go into the system, but there should be a way to check that because of changing relationships. Right. Logging is really critical. So we definitely want to make sure that actions taken, information viewed by proxies is recorded in some kind of log, and that log is then made available to the older adult. So possibly it's sent out as a paper statement in the mail to the older adult once a month. So the older adult can review what the person who's acting as their proxy is doing in their account. We probably also want to make sure that there are limits. There are likely in almost all e-services some functions or actions that shouldn't really be allowed to be taken by somebody who's only a proxy and not the actual account holder. So in the example of we're sending paper statements of log actions of a proxy to an older adult, that proxy probably shouldn't be able to change the mailing address, right? Because you could then envision, you could do fraudulent activities and make sure that the statement wasn't actually getting to the older adult. We also want to make sure that in certain cases that an older adult can fairly easily, without having to wait for an expiry date, cancel or block proxy access. If something suspicious is going on, this is going to be critical and probably needs to be available as something that can be done by phone rather than requiring the older adult to get into the system, which, you know, may be something that they're currently struggling with. And finally, if we're dealing with something like critical assets, like a bank account, it may be important that if we're setting up one proxy, we actually set up two, so that there's sort of a series of checks and balances, a system of watchdogs, so that every time one of the proxies does something in the bank account of Jane Doe or of Jane Doe's mother, maybe, then this is it. They're alerted that, you know, the other person who also has proxy access is going to be able to see that you did this. And so providing that sort of transparency, a sort of a checkpoint, wait a second, maybe I want to be careful about what I'm doing here, makes a lot of sense. When we think about sort of the fraud that can take place, you know, there's the people who set out to defraud somebody, who, you know, are very determined and have a detailed plan. This isn't going to actually stop them. But we think that a lot of the fraud that happens sort of gradually and gradually builds up. Oh, I'm helping my so-and-so with their banking. I can take $5 out of their account, and oh, they didn't notice when I did that last month, so this month I'm going to take out $10, and you can see this building. And so, you know, this could stop that initial foray into maybe some dealings that aren't quite above board. So those are all great, those design ideas for supporting proxy accounts. But we also, I think, need to think about the fact that even if you provide proxy accounts for an e-service, some people, some older adults are still likely to just share their password to get help. And if they're just sharing their password to get help, then this could be problematic. Sorry, are we at time, Yijan?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 minutes and just finish this. So we might want to ask people when they're logging in if they're a helper, and we might want to give them access codes. There are a number of different things that we can do to help provide transparency, even if someone is not using a proxy account. We could warn them before they're about to go into something they shouldn't. We could create proxies or pathways to create proxy accounts. So with that, I will sort of just speed through this. This is the takeaway. If you're designing smart mobility systems, you really need to consider the close others who may be helping with setup, monitoring, and maintaining those systems. And you probably want to set up proxy access with separate credentials and give people granular access control. All right. These are the people at the University of Manitoba who have supported, and I'll stop and say thank you.
Okay, thank you, Celine, for this great presentation, and it's really great to know that your study is based on that such a long time interview, and and the fact that you mentioned about the proxy account and banking is not that frustrating based on the approaches that you mentioned just now. And thank you for this presentation. It's really regretful that we do not have time for the question and answer part. So if you got any question, you can post your question in the chat channel, and you can also just directly email Celine. And thank you again for this great presentation. And we will see each other after 8 minutes and move on to the next session.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I think we have a pretty tough session chair here.
Sorry for that.
He gave 2 minutes extra, so that is thankful.
Well, good job, Shijian.
Yeah,
considering this is your first time.
Yeah,
thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. I got nervous again, but this two presentation is like really great, and I learned a lot. Take a lot away from you two presentation. Yeah.
Yeah, well, since we're in a break, I guess people can just chat for if they have questions to ask. the previous presenters, feel free to do so. I do have I would say an observation for like Celine's talk. First of all, I think it's really a great, very engaging talk. So like, you know that now there are a lot of systems now adopting the two-step verification. So now it's becoming more and more difficult to simply share your password, right? Sometimes you have to call your mom, like, oh, I tried to log in your bank, and then can you tell me what the code pop up on your phone? I'm not quite sure if in your study you have encountered this type of systems.
Yeah, we haven't seen anybody mention those yet. I think that they're still sort of fairly new and they're not in as much widespread use for these e-services yet. But I anticipate that will be an issue. So we also heard in some of the interviews we did that close others sometimes call these companies like banks or what have you and pretend to be the older adult in order to get things done, right? And that's great until something like, okay, well, we're sending you a verification code to your phone, and then that person won't have that, right? So it's definitely that kind of complication is going to make it harder for close others to help. Also biometrics, which is another way that we can see a lot of the authentication going. A close other is not going to have the same biometrics. And so that again is going to limit what's available. And it's really problematic because it doesn't support that gray area in between, somebody who just occasionally needs help.
Yeah, I remember quite a while ago, I pretend that I was my wife, but since my wife's gender and mine wouldn't revealed with our names, through our names, I managed to cheat the system, but even that is, I think, some sort of a problem still, right? I mean, looking at the name, no one says, and probably the more companies are not necessarily keeping track of the gender of the individuals, although some pay more attention than most others, like non-binary type of things, but still the banks particularly and other big corporations have lots of long road in front of them for that type of thing.
Yeah.
You also alluded to in your talk about the question is who will be the proxy to set up the proxy? Like if there's so many like systems that require proxy access and customized configuration, then it's hard for the older adults to do it themselves, right? Then become, with the popularity of this kind of approach, it itself poses a problem.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can, for those of us who are used to a lot of these digital systems, we can easily envision a matrix of, here are the types of things here are the people that, may be helping me, and here are all the different functions and views. And you just put a check in whether you want somebody to see that or have access to that functionality. That's not necessarily going to be something that's going to be easy for an older adult to deal with. And, if they have to do this once for every type of e-service that they use, this you can see this easily overwhelming them and becoming too much of a burden, in which case they just revert to the sharing passwords, right? So yeah, designing easy to use setup systems is going to be really, really critical to make this work. And maybe those setup systems need to be something that is done in person or on the phone. And then on the phone, how do you present information? You've only got the serial audio channel. That's definitely challenging. So yeah, it's a pretty open area where it's really unclear how best to do this.
Right. I'm more thinking like it's like this metrics that you mentioned, and then any system just take that. It's access control, right? So you express your preferences and your restrictions, and then a system just take it and config for you. But I guess there will potentially be problems.
Yeah, I mean, it's unclear that a matrix like that you could do one that would sort of work for everything for different e-services, right? So. I think Wrong is breaking up a little bit.
Yeah, I think Wrong, your audio is really cranky.
Yeah, it's kind of slow, so I kind of
Okay.
I'm turning off my video and hope it works a little better.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a little bit like the recommendation system, although this have higher security and privacy consequences. But
Yeah.
if you look at recommendation system, when you do one thing or a group of people select this set of options, then you potentially can recommend, at least you have a default and people can just fine tune it, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we're thinking about doing things like creating personas of like sort of multi-person personas that represent relationships. And so you pick the relationship that most closely resembles the relationship you have with your close other. And then those become like at least the starting point for the security and privacy configurations. So there's a lot of different approaches that we can take to sort of ease the burden, but it's a pretty big open area. So.
Yeah, there goes a great application of relational database.
A quick question for Celine. Do you have any idea, any thoughts on why that proxy system was set up in the US and why we haven't gotten around to it here?
I mean, I know the patient portal system was set up because with Obama's Affordable Care Act, he said hospitals have to do this or they'll lose their Medicare reimbursements. So that meant that all of these hospitals set up these systems, and then they had to show what was called reasonable use. No, I can't, some level of usage of the systems. They had to show that or they'd lose their Medicare. And I think one of the ways that they thought they could get more people using them is in the case where there were proxies, then if proxies could use them, that would count towards the amount of usage. So yeah, I think it was set up there. And the funny thing is that the systems, the underlying architecture of these systems definitely supports this, because parents are always allowed proxy access to their children's accounts in these patient portals. It's standard.
Yeah.
And yet some hospitals don't allow it for adults to specify a proxy and to share access.
It's oversight, and it's probably digital ageism, just assuming that like older adults don't know how, aren't interested, won't work
Possibly.
with their close ones. Yeah, it's interesting because they're both public systems too, right? Like, if it's important to the Medicare system, it would be important to Ontario Health, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.